Elena Cross stared at the cream-colored envelope in her hand, and her fingers went cold around the edges of it. She had not seen that handwriting in 3 years, yet she knew it instantly. Damien Voss, her ex-husband, the man who left her with nothing but a suitcase and an empty bank account while she was pregnant and terrified. Her assistant, Naomi, stood in the doorway of her office, watching her boss go pale. "You do not have to open it," Naomi said quietly. "Whatever it is, you can throw it away right now, and no one will ever know." Elena did not answer. She turned the envelope over and slid her thumb under the flap. Inside was a wedding invitation, thick and expensive, edged in gold foil. Damien Voss and Priya Malhotra request the pleasure of your company at their wedding celebration. At the very bottom, in Damien's own handwriting, was a short line that made Elena's stomach twist. "Come and see how far I have come without you." Naomi read the words over her shoulder and gasped. "He wants to humiliate you. That is what this is. He wants you to walk into that room so his new family can look at you and feel sorry for him for ever marrying someone like you." "I know exactly what he wants," Elena said, and her voice was steady, though her heart pounded hard against her ribs. 3 years ago, Elena had been a different woman. She had been soft-spoken, trusting, and desperately in love with a man who turned out to be cruel underneath his charm. When she told Damien she was pregnant, he did not celebrate. He panicked. His family was old money, and Elena came from nothing. A small town with a name nobody in his social circle could pronounce correctly. Within a month, Damien's mother, Constance Voss, convinced her son that Elena was an obstacle to the family's future plans. Damien filed for divorce before Elena even had a place to live. She lost the baby from the stress of it all, alone in a rented room with peeling wallpaper, and no one from the Voss family ever called to ask if she was alive. That memory still lived inside her like a splinter that never fully healed. But Elena had not stayed broken. She stood up from the floor of that rented room, and she built something from nothing. Now, sitting behind a glass desk on the top floor of a building that carried her company's name in tall silver letters, Elena Cross was not the same frightened girl Damien Voss had thrown away. Very few people outside her closest circle knew what she had actually built. She kept her name off headlines on purpose. She preferred to work in silence, letting her decisions speak instead of her face. It gave her an advantage that money alone could not buy. She placed the invitation down on her desk and looked at it for a long moment. "You are actually thinking about going," Naomi said, disbelief coloring her voice. "I am not thinking about it," Elena said. "I have already decided. Elena, he humiliated you. He left you when you needed him the most. Why would you walk back into that house and let them look at you like you are some kind of joke?" Elena stood up slowly and walked toward the window. Below her, the city moved in its usual rush, cars weaving between each other, people crossing streets without ever looking up. She had spent 3 years becoming someone none of them could recognize on sight, and there was a strange, quiet power in that. "Because they think I am still that same broken girl," Elena said. "They think I have nothing. They think I will show up in some borrowed dress and stand in the corner while they laugh behind their glasses of wine. Damien wants an audience for his victory. He wants to prove that leaving me was the smartest decision he ever made. So let him have his moment," Naomi said. "Why give him the satisfaction of watching you suffer?" "Because I am not going there to suffer," Elena said, and for the first time since she opened the envelope, a small, calm smile touched her lips. "I am going there to watch him find out exactly what he threw away." Naomi frowned, clearly confused, but she knew better than to press further when Elena's voice took on that particular tone. It was the same tone she used in board meetings right before she made a decision that changed the direction of the entire company. That evening, Elena stayed late in her office long after everyone else had gone home. She opened a private folder on her computer, one that few people had access to, and studied a name that had been sitting quietly inside her business dealings for over a year: Voss Holdings. She had known for months that Damien's family fortune was not as solid as it appeared to outsiders. Old money families sometimes hid cracks behind polished walls, and the Voss family was no different. Elena's investment firm, operating under a name that revealed nothing about her personal history, had quietly acquired a controlling stake in a lending firm that held significant loans connected to the Voss family's properties and business ventures. She had not planned this. When her firm first analyzed the lending company as a potential acquisition, she had not even realized the connection to her past. It was only months later, buried in a stack of loan documents, that she saw the name Voss Holdings and felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her. At the time, she had done nothing about it. She simply filed the information away and moved on with her work. Now, holding the wedding invitation in her mind, She understood why fate had placed that information in her hands. She was not a person who believed in revenge for its own sake. She believed in truth, and in letting people face the consequences of what they had built on lies and cruelty. Damien Voss wanted her to walk into his wedding as a broken woman he could pity. Instead, she would walk in as someone whose name was quietly written into the foundation holding up his entire family's future. She picked up her phone and called Marcus Reyes, the one person who had stood by her when everyone else disappeared. Marcus had been a struggling accountant 3 years ago, working out of a tiny office above a laundromat, when Elena walked in with nothing but an idea and desperate determination. He believed in her when banks refused to give her a single loan. Together, they built the company from the ground floor, quite literally starting with 2 desks and a second-hand computer. "You are not seriously going to that wedding," Marcus said the moment he answered the phone, his voice thick with concern. "I already RSVP'd," Elena said. There was a long pause on the other end. "Elena, I know you. I know that look you get when you are about to do something big. What is going on in your head?" "I want you to pull the full file on Voss Holdings," Elena said. "Every loan, every deadline, every payment they are behind on. I want it ready before the wedding." Marcus exhaled slowly. "You are going to use the company for this." "I am going to let the truth do what it always does," Elena said. "I am simply going to make sure I am standing there when it happens." After she hung up the phone, Elena sat in the quiet of her office for a long time, staring at the city lights spread out below her like scattered stars. She thought about the girl she used to be, curled up on a cold floor with no one to call and no one who cared whether she woke up the next morning. That girl was gone now, replaced by someone who had learned that the world only respected strength, and strength was something no one could hand to her. She had built it herself, piece by piece, mistake by mistake, until it became armor she never had to take off again. The wedding was in 4 days. Elena opened her closet and pulled out a simple black dress, elegant but understated, nothing that screamed wealth or status. She wanted Damien and his family to underestimate her for as long as possible. Let them believe she was still small. Let them whisper behind her back, and smile with fake pity in their eyes. Every second they spent underestimating her was a second she could use to watch their world unravel from the inside. She placed the invitation back inside its envelope and slid it into her desk drawer, right next to a framed photograph of the tiny office above the laundromat, where everything had begun. It was a reminder of how far she had come, and a promise to herself that she would never again let anyone make her feel small. Before she left, Elena paused by the small shelf near her window, where she kept a handful of objects that meant something only to her. A cracked mug from the old office above the laundromat. A photograph of Marcus grinning beside their very first company sign, the letters slightly crooked because they had painted it themselves at midnight, too excited to wait for morning. She picked up the mug and turned it over in her hands, remembering nights when she and Marcus had nothing but instant noodles and a shared belief that things would eventually change. There had been a time, not long after the divorce, when Elena doubted every decision she made. She remembered walking past a bakery one winter evening, watching families through the window, laughing over warm bread, and feeling like an outsider looking in on a life she was never meant to have. She had cried in that doorway, quietly, so no one passing by would notice. It was one of the lowest moments of her life, and she never forgot it, because it was also the moment she decided she would not let bitterness define her. She would let it fuel her instead. She thought of Constance Voss, the woman who had looked at her with such open contempt during the divorce proceedings, calling her unsuitable in front of lawyers as if Elena were an item being returned to a store. She thought of Damien's silence during those months, how he never once defended her, never once stood between his mother's cruelty and Elena's breaking heart. It would have been easy to let that silence turn into hatred. Instead, Elena had turned it into fuel for something far more useful than anger. She turned it into ambition. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her out of the memory. She glanced at the screen and saw a second message from Julian Voss, this one slightly longer than the first. "I do not want to intrude if I am wrong about this, but if it truly is you, I think we should speak before the wedding. There are things you may not know." Elena read the message twice, her brow furrowing slightly. Julian had always been different from the rest of the family, quieter, more thoughtful, someone who seemed uncomfortable with the way his wife and son treated people beneath their social standing. Elena had never fully understood why he stayed silent all those years ago, but something in his tone now told her that silence might not have been by choice. She did not respond yet. There would be time for that conversation, but not tonight. Tonight, she needed to prepare herself, mentally and emotionally, for the 4 days ahead. As she turned off the lights and prepared to leave the office, her phone buzzed once more with a message from an unknown number. It was Julian Voss, Damien's father. Someone she had barely spoken to during her marriage. The message was short, almost hesitant. "I saw your name on a company report today. Is it really you, Elena?" Elena stared at the screen for a long moment, her heart beating steady and calm. She did not reply right away. Instead, she slipped her phone into her bag, turned off the office lights, and walked out into the night, ready for whatever the next 4 days would bring. The Voss family estate looked exactly the same as Elena remembered. Tall iron gates, manicured hedges cut into perfect shapes, and a fountain in the front courtyard that never seemed to stop running even in the coldest months. She stepped out of the car, smoothed the front of her black dress, and walked toward the entrance with her chin level and her shoulders relaxed. Every part of her wanted to turn around, but she forced her feet to keep moving forward. A uniformed staff member greeted her at the door and led her toward the dining hall, where the pre-wedding dinner was already underway. The moment she stepped through the archway, conversations dimmed, heads turned. Elena felt dozens of eyes settle on her like weight pressing against her skin, but she kept walking, calm and composed, as if she had done this 100 times before. Damien saw her first. He stood near the head of the table, dressed in a tailored suit, his arm around Priya Malhotra, a striking woman with dark hair pinned elegantly at the back of her neck. Damien's expression shifted from surprise to something colder, something almost triumphant. "Elena," he said, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "I did not think you would actually come." "You invited me," Elena said simply. It would have been rude not to. A few quiet laughs rippled through the guests, though Elena could not tell if they were laughing with her or at her. She did not care either way. Constance Voss rose from her seat at the far end of the table, her silver hair swept into a tight bun, her eyes sharp and assessing as they moved over Elena from head to toe. "Well," Constance said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "look who decided to grace us with her presence. I must say, Elena, you look well for someone who has clearly struggled these past few years." "I have been busy," Elena said evenly. "Busy," Constance repeated, exchanging a knowing look with a woman seated beside her. "I imagine it must be difficult, finding work after everything that happened. Damien mentioned you never finished your studies." Elena did not flinch. "Some of the most successful people I know never finished their studies either." Priya studied Elena carefully throughout the exchange, something calculating in her gaze that suggested she was not as easily fooled as the rest of the family. She stepped forward and extended a polite hand. "It is nice to finally meet the woman Damien talks about so rarely," she said, her tone light, but her eyes searching. "All good things, I hope," Elena replied, shaking her hand. "Mostly brief things," Priya said, and there was something sharp beneath her smile, something that told Elena this woman noticed more than she let on. Before they took their seats, Damien found a moment to approach Elena alone near the entrance to the dining hall, his voice low enough that only she could hear him. "I have to admit, I am impressed you actually showed up," he said, a faint smirk tugging at his mouth. "I thought you would be too embarrassed, considering everything." "Embarrassed about what, exactly?" Elena asked, keeping her tone light. "About losing," Damien said simply. "About watching me build the life we were supposed to have together. Except now it is with someone who actually fits into it." Elena tilted her head slightly, studying him the way one might study a stranger, rather than someone she had once shared a home with. "You say that as though I am still standing where you left me, Damien, as though nothing has happened in 3 years except waiting for you to notice me again." Something flickered across his face, uncertainty perhaps, though he masked it quickly with a short laugh. "Do not tell me you built some little business and think that makes us equals now." "I have not thought about equals in a very long time," Elena said. "I stopped comparing myself to you the day I realized comparison was the only thing keeping me small." Damien opened his mouth to respond, but at that moment, Constance called everyone to the table, and the conversation was cut short. Elena walked past him calmly, taking her assigned seat near the middle of the long table, sandwiched between an elderly relative who barely acknowledged her, and a young cousin who seemed far more interested in her phone than the dinner itself. Dinner continued, and throughout the meal, Damien took every opportunity to remind the table of Elena's past, dropping small comments about how far he had come since their divorce, how much better his life had become without the burden of someone who could never fit into his world. Elena listened without reacting, occasionally offering a calm reply that gave nothing away. She noticed that the more composed she remained, the more agitated Damien became, as though her silence was a puzzle he could not solve. At one point, Damien leaned back in his chair, swirling wine in his glass. You know, Elena, I always wondered what happened to you after everything fell apart. Did you find work eventually? A small shop somewhere, perhaps? I run a company, Elena said simply. The table quieted slightly. Damien raised an eyebrow, clearly expecting her to elaborate, to justify herself, to give him something he could mock. She offered nothing more. A company, Constance repeated, amusement lacing her tone. How charming. What sort of company? The kind that pays attention to details, Elena said, holding Constance's gaze steadily. You would be surprised how much can be learned by paying close attention to the right details. There was something in the way she said it, calm but layered, that made a few guests shift uncomfortably in their seats, unsure exactly what she meant but sensing an undercurrent they could not quite name. A distant cousin, seated closer to Constance, tried to smooth over the sudden tension by asking Elena polite, harmless questions about where she lived and whether she had traveled recently. Elena answered each question briefly, careful not to reveal too much, though she noticed Constance listening intently to every word, searching for something she could later use against her. It was a habit Elena remembered well from her marriage, the way Constance collected small pieces of information like weapons, storing them away for the moment they would do the most damage. At one point, a family friend leaned toward Constance and whispered something Elena could not hear, though she caught her own name mentioned in passing. Constance's lips curved into a thin smile before she turned back toward the table, satisfied with whatever gossip had just been exchanged. Elena kept her expression neutral, refusing to give the room the reaction it seemed to be waiting for. Julian Voss, who had been quiet throughout most of the dinner, watched Elena with narrowed eyes from across the table. He had not spoken directly to her yet, but his gaze kept drifting toward her whenever she spoke, as if he were trying to place a memory just out of reach. Toward the end of the meal, when the conversation shifted toward wedding logistics and guest arrangements, Julian rose from his seat and excused himself quietly. Elena noticed him step out through the side door leading toward the garden, and something told her he needed a moment alone with his thoughts. She did not follow him, not yet. There would be time for that conversation soon enough. As dessert was served, Damien made one final attempt to unsettle her. He stood, raising his glass for a toast, and though it was meant to celebrate his upcoming marriage, his words carried a pointed edge aimed directly at Elena. To new beginnings, he said, looking around the table before letting his gaze settle on her, and to leaving the past exactly where it belongs. Guests raised their glasses, murmuring agreement, though a few exchanged uncertain glances at the obvious tension beneath his words. Elena raised her glass as well, her expression calm, almost pleasant. To new beginnings, she echoed. They have a way of revealing exactly who someone really is. Damien's smile faltered for the briefest moment, before he covered it with a laugh, turning back toward his guests as if nothing had happened. But Priya was watching Elena closely now, her earlier curiosity sharpening into something more focused. She excused herself shortly after, and found Elena near the hallway, as the guests began moving toward the sitting room for after-dinner drinks. You are not what I expected, Priya said quietly, once they were slightly apart from the others. What did you expect? Elena asked. Someone smaller, Priya admitted. Damien made it sound like you disappeared after the divorce. Like you had nothing left, but you do not carry yourself like someone with nothing. Elena studied the other woman for a moment, noting the intelligence behind her eyes, the way she chose her words carefully, testing rather than accusing. People often assume things about others based on the story they are told, Elena said. It is usually wiser to look for the truth yourself. Kimen Truv. Priya's eyes narrowed slightly, not with hostility, but with genuine curiosity. And what is the truth exactly? Priya glanced back toward the dining room, where Damien's voice could still be heard, confident and easy, entertaining guests without a single doubt clouding his expression. He tells everyone you could never keep up with this life, Priya said, turning back to Elena. That you wanted things you could never have and blamed him when reality caught up with you. That is one version of the story, Elena said. Is it true? No, Elena said simply. But I understand why it is easier for him to believe. Priya studied her for a long moment, arms crossed loosely, her expression unreadable. I did not come from money either, not really, she admitted quietly. My family worked hard for everything we have. Sometimes I wonder if Damien sees me the same way he saw you, at least in the beginning. Someone to fit into his world rather than someone he actually chose. Elena felt an unexpected flicker of sympathy for the other woman, though she said nothing about it directly. You will know the truth eventually, she said instead. Everyone always does. You will see it soon enough, Elena said, offering a small, unreadable smile before excusing herself toward the garden doors. Outside, the evening air was cool, and the garden lights cast a soft golden glow over the pathways. Elena found Julian standing near the fountain at the far end, his hands clasped behind his back, staring at the water as though it held answers he could not find elsewhere. "You wanted to speak with me," Elena said, stepping closer. Julian turned, and for a long moment he simply studied her face, as though comparing it to a memory buried deep in his mind. "I saw your name in a business report last month," he said finally. "Chief financial backer of a firm connected to several major lending institutions. I told myself it could not be the same Elena. But now that I see you, I know it is." Elena said nothing, waiting for him to continue. "I do not know how much you understand about our current situation," Julian said, his voice lower now, careful. "But this family is not as secure as it appears. There are debts, obligations, things Damien does not fully grasp because he has never had to worry about money in his life." He paused, glancing back toward the house where laughter and conversation spilled out from the open windows. "If you are here for some kind of reckoning, Elena, I understand it. God knows you deserve one. But I need you to know that whatever happens, I never agreed with how you were treated. I was a coward for staying silent, and I have regretted it every day since." Elena studied him carefully, searching his face for deception and finding none, only quiet, tired honesty. "Regret does not undo what happened, Julian," she said softly. "But I appreciate you saying it. Does Damien know about the debts?" Elena asked. Julian shook his head, glancing again toward the house. "He knows there are loans. He does not know how close we are to losing everything if the terms are not renegotiated soon. His mother has kept most of the details from him, afraid it would damage his confidence right before the wedding. I have tried to tell her that hiding the truth only makes the eventual fall harder, but she does not listen to me anymore. She has not listened to me in years." "And Priya?" Elena asked. "Does she know what she is marrying into?" "I do not think so," Julian admitted. "She comes from a family with its own wealth, though nothing on the scale Constance likes people to believe we still have. I suspect Priya assumes she is marrying into stability. I am not certain that is entirely true anymore." Elena absorbed this quietly, piecing together details that confirmed much of what her own research had already suggested. The Voss family's public image was built on a foundation that had been slowly eroding for years, hidden behind expensive dinners and carefully staged appearances. "What are you planning to do?" he asked. Elena looked back toward the house, where Damien's laughter carried faintly through the night air, confident and untroubled, completely unaware of the storm quietly gathering around him. "I am not planning anything yet," she said. "I am simply here to see clearly what everyone else has been too blind or too comfortable to notice." Julian nodded slowly, though worry lingered behind his eyes. As they stood there in silence, the fountain bubbling softly beside them, neither of them noticed Priya watching from the shadow of the doorway, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the conversation she could not quite hear, but somehow understood carried more weight than either of them was willing to admit. 3 years earlier, Elena Cross had woken up on the floor of a rented room with nothing but a suitcase, a folder of divorce papers, and a pain in her chest that felt like it would never fully leave. The landlord had given her 30 days to find another place, and she had less than $200 to her name. She remembered staring at the ceiling that morning, wondering how her life had collapsed so completely in the span of a few short weeks. She had married Damien Voss, believing in the version of him he showed her during their courtship, kind, attentive, full of promises about the life they would build together. She had not understood, not fully, how much his family's approval controlled every decision he made. When she became pregnant, she thought it would bring them closer. Instead, it exposed exactly how thin his loyalty to her really was. Constance Voss made it clear, in cold, precise words, that Elena would never be welcomed into the family, and Damien, rather than defending his wife, chose silence. Silence that eventually became divorce papers left on the kitchen counter while Elena was at a doctor's appointment. She lost the pregnancy 2 weeks after signing those papers, alone in a hospital room with no one beside her, having called Damien 3 times without receiving a single reply. That loss carved something into her that never fully closed, a wound she learned to carry quietly rather than let it consume her entirely. The day Damien left, Elena remembered every small detail with painful clarity. She had come home from the doctor's appointment carrying a small bag of prenatal vitamins, humming quietly to herself despite the anxiety she had been carrying for weeks about the state of her marriage. She found the apartment unusually quiet, and at first she assumed Damien was simply out running an errand. It was only when she walked into the kitchen and saw the folder resting on the counter, her name printed neatly across the top of the divorce papers, that the quiet suddenly felt like a warning rather than an accident. She had called him 7 times that afternoon. He answered on the 8th call, his voice flat and distant, as though he were discussing a business matter rather than the end of their marriage. He told her his mother had made arrangements for her to vacate the apartment within 2 weeks, and that a modest settlement had already been transferred to her account, an amount that felt more like an insult than compensation for the life they had built together. When Elena asked him, through tears she could not control, whether he intended to be present for the birth of their child, he had gone silent for a long moment before saying quietly that it would be better for everyone if she simply moved on without him. That single phone call had ended the version of Elena who believed love was something stable, something that could not be dismantled by outside pressure or family disapproval. She hung up the phone that day and sat on the kitchen floor for nearly 3 hours, unable to move, unable to fully process how quickly her entire future had been rewritten by people who barely considered her worth a conversation. For the first few months after the divorce, Elena drifted. She took small jobs wherever she could find them, waiting tables, filing paperwork for a local accounting office, anything that paid enough to keep a roof over her head. It was at that accounting office where she met Marcus Reyes, a quiet, hard-working man a few years older than her, who noticed her sharp mind long before she recognized it in herself. "You see patterns other people miss," Marcus told her one evening, as they stayed late reviewing a client's financial records. "You should not be filing paperwork, you should be building something." Elena had laughed at the idea then, exhausted and uncertain, still carrying too much grief to imagine a future beyond simply surviving each day. But Marcus did not let the idea go. Over the following months, he introduced her to small business owners struggling with their finances, and Elena found she had a natural talent for identifying inefficiencies, spotting opportunities others overlooked, and restructuring failing operations into profitable ones. It started small, advising a struggling bakery on inventory costs, helping a local repair shop renegotiate supplier contracts. Word spread slowly, one satisfied client recommending her to another. Within a year, Elena and Marcus had saved enough to rent a tiny office above a laundromat, furnished with 2 second-hand desks and a computer that crashed more often than it worked. They painted their own sign at midnight, the letters slightly crooked, both of them too excited and too broke to hire someone else to do it properly. Elena often thought back to those early days as the true foundation of everything she later built. There had been countless nights where she and Marcus survived on instant noodles and shared determination, refusing to give up even when banks rejected their loan applications again and again. She remembered walking out of one particularly discouraging meeting with a loan officer who barely looked up from his desk while rejecting her proposal, and standing outside the building in the rain, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake believing she could build something from nothing. But she kept going. Slowly, client by client, her reputation grew. She developed a keen understanding of struggling companies, businesses drowning in debt or mismanagement, and she began acquiring small stakes in companies she believed she could help turn around. Her first real success came when she helped restructure a failing textile company, saving nearly 200 jobs in the process, and turning a business on the verge of collapse into a profitable operation within 18 months. That success brought attention, investors, and eventually, enough capital to expand into larger ventures. One client from that early period stayed with her long after the deal itself was finished. An elderly widow named Margaret Doyle owned a small hardware store that had been in her family for 3 generations, and she was on the verge of losing it entirely due to a predatory loan she had signed years earlier, without fully understanding the terms. Elena spent weeks negotiating with the lender, restructuring the debt, and eventually helping Margaret secure a fair repayment plan that saved the store from closing. Margaret had cried in the middle of the shop the day the papers were finalized, gripping Elena's hands tightly and telling her that she had given her family's legacy back to her. That moment stayed with Elena longer than any of the larger, more lucrative deals that followed. It reminded her why she had chosen this path in the first place, not simply to accumulate wealth, but to use the skills she had built out of necessity to help people who had been failed by systems designed to overlook them. It was a principle she carried into every decision afterward, even as her company grew larger, and the stakes of each deal became increasingly significant. By the time 2 years had passed since her divorce, Elena Cross had quietly become the driving force behind a growing investment firm, though she kept her personal name out of most public materials, preferring the company itself to carry the reputation rather than her own face. It was a decision born partly from privacy, and partly from a lingering wariness of being recognized, judged, or reduced once again to the woman Damien Voss had left behind. It was during this period of expansion that her firm identified a lending company as a potential acquisition target, a mid-sized financial institution that held numerous loans across various industries, including real estate and small business ventures. Elena and Marcus spent months analyzing the company's portfolio before finalizing the acquisition, examining loan agreements, assessing risk, and identifying which accounts represented strong investments and which represented liabilities. It was Marcus who first noticed the name buried within a stack of loan documents one late evening, several months after the acquisition had been finalized. He had been reviewing outstanding loans tied to real estate holdings when he came across a name that made him pause. "Elena," he said, sliding a folder across her desk. "You need to see this." She had opened the folder without much thought, expecting another routine loan review. Instead, she found herself staring at the name Voss Holdings, attached to multiple outstanding loans, including a significant mortgage on a large family estate, and financing tied to a struggling business venture Damien had recently launched. For a long moment, Elena simply stared at the paperwork, her mind racing through the implications. She had not sought this out. She had not planned it. Fate, or perhaps simple coincidence, had placed this information directly into her hands. "Do you want me to reassign this account to someone else?" Marcus asked carefully, watching her reaction. Elena had considered it, briefly. It would have been easy to step away, to let someone else manage the account and avoid any personal entanglement with her past. But something inside her resisted the idea. She was not the same woman who had once been powerless against this family's cruelty. She now held a position of genuine influence, and for the first time since her divorce, she felt something other than grief when she thought about Damien Voss and his family. "No," she said finally, "I will handle it myself." That night, after Marcus had gone home, Elena stayed alone in her office long past midnight, reading through the loan documents again and again, until the words blurred together. She thought about the many nights she had spent wondering whether Damien ever thought about her, whether he felt even a flicker of guilt for the way he had disappeared from her life without a single backward glance. She thought about Constance's cold voice during the divorce proceedings, calling her an embarrassment to the family name, and she thought about the silence that had followed her out of that courtroom, a silence no one from the Voss family had ever bothered to break. For years she had told herself she no longer needed anything from them, not an apology, not an explanation, nothing at all, and that was still true. But holding this file in her hands, she understood that the universe had handed her something rare, a chance to see the truth clearly rather than simply walking away and letting them continue believing their own carefully constructed story. Over the following months, Elena reviewed every detail of the Voss family's financial obligations with careful precision. She discovered that Constance had taken out multiple loans against the family estate to fund extravagant social events, believing that maintaining appearances would secure advantageous business relationships and marriage prospects for Damien. She discovered that Damien's most recent business venture, a boutique investment firm bearing his name, was hemorrhaging money due to poor decisions and an over-reliance on his family's reputation rather than genuine expertise. None of this information changed Elena's day-to-day life immediately. She continued running her company, expanding into new markets, mentoring young entrepreneurs the way Marcus had once mentored her. But she kept the Voss Holdings file close, reviewing it periodically, watching the family's financial position grow increasingly fragile with each passing quarter. When the wedding invitation arrived, everything shifted into focus. Sitting in her office the night after the pre-wedding dinner, Elena reviewed the file once more, this time with a clarity she had not allowed herself before. The loans were due for renegotiation within the coming weeks. If the Voss family failed to meet the revised terms, her firm held every right to call in the outstanding balances, a move that would trigger a cascade of consequences across their remaining assets, including the family estate itself. She was not obligated to show mercy. She was not obligated to give them any warning at all. Legally and financially, the decision rested entirely within her authority. But Elena had never been interested in destruction simply for the sake of causing pain. She wanted something more precise than that. She wanted them to understand, fully and completely, the truth of what they had thrown away and the reality of what they now depended on to survive. She thought carefully about timing. Calling in the loans too early would simply look like an act of spite, easily dismissed as bitterness from a scorned ex-wife. She needed the truth to surface in a way that could not be denied or twisted into a smaller story than it actually was. The wedding itself, with its audience of family, business partners, and society figures who had spent years admiring the Voss family's carefully polished image, would be the moment the truth carried the most weight. It was not about causing a scene for its own sake. It was about making certain that when the truth finally emerged, no one in that room would be able to look away from it, or explain it away as something smaller than it truly was. She opened her laptop and began drafting a formal notice, reviewing the exact terms of the loan agreements one final time, checking every figure against the original documents to ensure complete accuracy. She had learned early in her career that credibility depended entirely on precision. If even one detail was incorrect, it would give the Voss family an opening to discredit the entire situation. She would not give them that opportunity. Marcus arrived at her office late that evening, carrying a fresh set of documents outlining the exact terms and deadlines tied to the Voss family loans. He set them down on her desk and studied her expression carefully. "You do not have to do this," he said quietly. "Whatever you decide, I will support you. But I want to make sure this is what you actually want, not just something you feel obligated to do because the opportunity exists." Elena looked up at him, the man who had believed in her when no one else did, who had stood beside her through every failure and every small victory that eventually built into something larger than either of them had imagined possible. "I am not doing this out of anger," she said slowly, choosing her words with care. "I am doing this because the truth deserves to be seen." Damien built his entire identity around believing he escaped something beneath him. Constance built her cruelty around the belief that money and status excuse everything. I simply want them to see clearly, for once in their lives, exactly how fragile that belief truly is. Marcus nodded, understanding settling over his features. "And Priya? She seems caught in the middle of something she did not create." Elena considered this for a long moment, remembering the sharp intelligence in Priya's eyes during their conversation in the hallway. "Priya deserves the truth more than anyone else in that family," she said finally. "Whatever happens, she should not walk into a marriage built on lies she was never given the chance to see." Outside her office window, the city stretched out under a darkening sky, lights beginning to flicker on across countless buildings, each one holding its own quiet story of struggle and survival. Elena thought about the girl she used to be, curled up on a cold floor with nothing but grief and uncertainty, and she thought about the woman she had become, standing now at the center of a decision capable of reshaping an entire family's future. She closed the file, gathered her thoughts, and made her decision. The wedding was in 3 days. She would attend, exactly as planned, but this time, she would not simply observe. She would begin setting into motion the sequence of events that would finally reveal the truth Damien and his family had spent years hiding, not only from the world, but from themselves. Before closing her laptop for the night, Elena sent a brief message to Marcus, asking him to prepare a formal summary of the loan terms and outstanding balances, ready to be delivered the moment she gave the signal. She also asked him to quietly verify Julian's financial standing separately from the rest of the family, sensing that his honesty during their earlier conversation in the garden deserved to be treated with more care than the rest of the Voss household. Whatever happened in the coming days, she did not want an innocent man to suffer simply because he happened to share a last name with people who had caused so much harm. She looked once more at the photograph on her shelf, the crooked handwritten sign above the laundromat, and allowed herself a small, quiet moment of pride. Whatever unfolded at the wedding, she would walk into that room as exactly who she had built herself to become, not the woman Damien remembered, and not the woman Constance had tried to erase, but someone entirely her own. Priya Malhotra could not stop thinking about the strange calm she had seen in Elena Cross during the pre-wedding dinner. Something about the woman did not match the story Damien had told her over the past year, and Priya was not someone who ignored a feeling that refused to settle. She sat at her laptop late that night, searching Elena's name across every platform she could think of, expecting to find scattered social media posts or a modest employment history, the kind of digital footprint most people left behind without even trying. Instead, she found almost nothing. There were no social media accounts under Elena's full name, no employment records listed publicly, no articles mentioning her by name in connection to any company. It was as though Elena Cross had deliberately erased herself from public view, which struck Priya as far more unusual than simply having no accomplishments to speak of. People who had nothing to hide rarely worked this hard to remain invisible. She narrowed her search, adding terms related to finance and investment firms, industries Elena had vaguely referenced during their conversation. After nearly an hour of digging through registration filings and corporate databases, Priya found a single reference, buried within a confidential shareholder document that had somehow been indexed by a search engine before being taken down. The name Elena Cross appeared as a majority stakeholder in a private investment firm, one that Priya recognized only because of its connection to a well-known acquisition involving a struggling textile company several years earlier. Priya sat back in her chair, staring at the screen, trying to piece together what this meant. If Elena truly held a significant position within a private investment firm, why would Damien describe her as someone who had nothing, someone who had failed to build any kind of life after their divorce? Either Damien did not know the truth, or he knew and had chosen to hide it from everyone, including her. She considered mentioning it to Damien directly, but something held her back. Instead, she decided to observe more closely over the following days, paying attention to every interaction between Damien's family and the woman who seemed to unsettle all of them despite her calm exterior. Priya closed her laptop that night without reaching any firm conclusions, though a quiet unease settled over her that refused to fade. She thought back to small moments over the past year that had felt slightly off. Damien's reluctance to discuss his family's finances in detail, Constance's insistence on extravagant wedding arrangements despite occasional tension in conversations about budget, and Damien's strange defensiveness whenever Elena's name happened to come up. None of it had seemed significant on its own, but together, the pieces formed a picture she could no longer ignore. She thought about her own parents, who had built their modest success through years of careful, honest work, and she thought about how disappointed they would be if she married into a family built on illusions rather than substance. She was not someone who frightened easily, but the idea of walking into a marriage blind to the truth of her partner's circumstances felt like a risk she was no longer willing to accept without answers. The following evening, a rehearsal dinner was held at a private event space attached to one of the city's most exclusive hotels. Damien, increasingly agitated by Elena's continued presence and the questions it seemed to raise among his family and business associates, decided the moment had come to reassert control over the narrative he had spent years building. Standing near the head table with a glass of wine in hand, Damien addressed a small cluster of guests, his voice carrying just enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "It is interesting, is it not?" he said, glancing toward Elena, who stood quietly near the edge of the room speaking with Julian. "How some people show up to events uninvited to their own success, simply because they cannot bear to watch someone else's happiness, without inserting themselves into it." A few guests chuckled uncomfortably, unsure whether the comment was meant as a joke or a genuine accusation. Elena turned toward him calmly, unbothered by the attempt at humiliation. "I believe I was invited, Damien," she said evenly. "You wrote the invitation yourself, if I recall correctly." "A formality," Damien said, waving a hand dismissively. "I did not actually expect you to take it seriously. I suppose old habits die hard. You were always the type to hold on to things long after they stopped meaning anything." The room grew quieter, sensing the tension building beneath the surface of his words. Elena studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable, before responding. "You are right about one thing," she said. "Old habits do die hard. Yours, for instance. You still cannot resist trying to make yourself feel bigger by making someone else feel smaller." A ripple of surprised murmurs spread through the nearby guests. Damien's jaw tightened, clearly caught off guard by her steady response. He opened his mouth to reply, but before he could speak, one of his business associates, a man named Andrew Whitfield who had been quietly observing the exchange from a nearby table, rose from his seat with a curious expression on his face. "Wait," Andrew said slowly, studying Elena's face as though matching it against a memory. "Elena Cross, you are the majority stakeholder behind Vesper Capital, are you not? I recognize you from the shareholder briefing last spring." The room fell into a heavy, uncertain silence. Damien turned sharply toward Andrew, confusion flashing across his face. "What are you talking about?" Andrew glanced between Damien and Elena, clearly sensing he had stumbled into something far more complicated than a simple family gathering. "Vesper Capital," he repeated, "the firm that holds a significant portion of the debt tied to several major real estate portfolios in this city. I sat across from her during a negotiation meeting for one of my own company's loans. She restructured our entire repayment plan personally." Constance, seated nearby, went visibly pale, her wine glass frozen halfway to her lips. She exchanged a sharp, panicked glance with Julian, who remained carefully composed, though a flicker of something unreadable passed behind his eyes. "That cannot be right," Damien said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Elena does not have that kind of position. She barely had a job when we were married." "I did not have a job when we were married," Elena said calmly. "That was 3 years ago, Damien. People change. Some people build entire futures out of the ashes left behind by others." Andrew, sensing the growing tension but not yet fully understanding its source, attempted to steer the conversation elsewhere, but the damage had already been done. Whispers spread rapidly through the room, guests leaning toward one another, exchanging confused and curious glances. Priya, standing near the edge of the gathering, watched the unfolding scene with sharp, focused attention, her earlier suspicions solidifying into something far more certain. For a brief moment, the room seemed suspended in uncertainty, guests unsure whether to continue their conversations or wait for someone to address the tension directly. A server moving between tables paused near Constance, offering to refill her glass, and she waved the young woman away with a sharp, distracted gesture, her attention entirely fixed on the unfolding crisis in front of her. Constance recovered first, forcing a tight smile as she attempted to regain control of the room. "I am sure there has simply been some confusion," she said smoothly, though her voice carried a slight tremor she could not fully hide. "Elena, dear, perhaps you should clarify things before rumors get out of hand." Elena met her gaze steadily. "I am not sure what needs clarifying, Constance. I run an investment firm. It is not a secret, though I understand it might come as a surprise to people who assumed I disappeared after the divorce." Damien stared at her, something shifting behind his eyes, a mixture of disbelief and dawning unease. He had spent months, perhaps years, building a narrative in his mind where Elena remained frozen exactly where he left her, struggling and irrelevant, while he moved forward into a brighter, more prosperous future. The idea that she had not only survived but thrived in ways that intersected directly with his family's business dealings unsettled something deep within him that he was not prepared to confront in front of a room full of guests. Julian stepped forward quietly, placing a steadying hand on Damien's shoulder. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation privately," he said, his voice calm but firm, carrying an authority that momentarily silenced the room. Damien nodded stiffly, though his eyes remained fixed on Elena, searching her face for some sign of the woman he remembered, the one who would have shrunk under this kind of scrutiny, who would have apologized simply for existing in a room where she was not wanted. He found nothing of that woman remaining. Only someone entirely unfamiliar, composed and unshaken, standing exactly where she belonged. As the guests slowly returned to their conversations, unsure exactly what they had just witnessed, Priya quietly made her way toward Elena, her expression a careful mixture of caution and curiosity. "Vesper Capital," Priya said quietly, once they were slightly apart from the others. "That is your company." "Yes," Elena said simply. Priya studied her for a long moment. "And the loans tied to this family's properties? The ones Andrew mentioned, are they connected to you as well?" Elena held her gaze steadily, choosing her next words with care. "I think it would be better if you asked Damien and his mother that question directly," she said. "But I will tell you this much. Whatever you decide to do with the truth once you learn it, you deserve to know it before you make any promises you cannot take back." Priya's expression tightened, understanding beginning to settle over her features, though she said nothing further. She glanced back toward Damien, who stood near his mother, his voice low and urgent as he spoke with Julian, his earlier confidence completely unraveled. Before Elena left the venue, Damien caught up with her near the entrance, his composure now fully replaced by barely restrained frustration. "What exactly are you trying to do here?" he demanded, keeping his voice low so the departing guests would not overhear. "You show up out of nowhere, and suddenly my business associates are talking about you like you are some kind of financial powerhouse. Is this some kind of game to you?" "This is not a game, Damien," Elena said calmly. "This is simply the truth catching up to a story you have been telling for a very long time." "What truth?" he snapped. "That you got lucky with some investments? That does not erase what happened between us. It does not change the fact that I moved on and built a real life while you were busy playing pretend with numbers on a spreadsheet." Elena studied him for a long moment, noting the panic hidden just beneath his anger. "I am not here to erase anything, Damien. I am here because you sent me an invitation, and because the truth eventually finds its way into every room, whether or not it is welcome." "You still have not answered my question," he said, his voice tightening further. "Are you connected to the loans on this family's properties?" "Andrew mentioned Vesper Capital like it was common knowledge. Is that your company?" Elena held his gaze steadily, refusing to let him bait her into revealing more than she intended. "You should ask your mother that question," she said quietly. "I suspect she already knows the answer far better than you do." Damien's expression faltered, uncertainty flickering behind his eyes as he glanced back toward Constance, who stood near the exit, forcing polite smiles at departing guests while her hands remained tightly clasped in front of her, knuckles pale with tension. "This is not over," Damien said finally, though his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "No," Elena agreed calmly. "It is not. She walked past him and out into the cool night air, leaving him standing alone near the entrance, his carefully constructed world beginning to show cracks he could no longer ignore. Behind her, the Voss family's polished image continued crumbling quietly in front of the very people they had spent years trying hardest to impress, and for the first time in 3 years, Elena felt something settle inside her that resembled peace rather than pain. The rehearsal dinner ended shortly after, guests departing with hushed conversations trailing behind them. The polished image the Voss family had spent years constructing now visibly cracked in front of the very people they had always tried hardest to impress. Julian Voss found Elena the next morning at a small cafe near her office, a quiet corner table she often used when she needed space to think clearly away from the noise of her company. He had called ahead, asking for a private conversation before the wedding proceeded any further, and Elena had agreed, sensing that whatever he wanted to discuss carried weight beyond simple pleasantries. He looked older than he had the previous evening. Exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes as he took the seat across from her. "I assume you already know why I asked to meet," he said quietly. "I have some idea," Elena said. Julian folded his hands on the table, choosing his words carefully. "Andrew was not wrong last night. Vesper Capital holds the majority of the outstanding debt tied to our estate, along with significant financing behind Damien's investment firm. I have known for several months that our situation was fragile, but I did not fully understand how deeply intertwined it had become with your company until last night." Elena studied him, saying nothing, waiting for him to continue. "I want to ask you directly," Julian said. "What do you intend to do with that position?" Elena considered her answer carefully before responding. "I intend to do exactly what any responsible firm would do when a client fails to meet the terms of their agreement," she said. "Nothing more and nothing less. And if the family fails to meet those terms?" Julian asked, though his voice suggested he already suspected the answer. "Then the loans will be called," Elena said simply. "The properties tied to those loans, including the estate, would be subject to repossession according to the original agreements Constance signed." Julian absorbed this information quietly, his expression heavy with a mixture of resignation and something that resembled relief, as though a truth he had long anticipated was finally being spoken aloud rather than avoided. "I suspected as much," he said. "I want you to know, Elena, that whatever happens, I do not blame you for this. If anything, I understand it as a consequence this family has been avoiding for far too long." "I am not doing this out of cruelty, Julian," Elena said. "I want to be clear about that. I am simply not willing to extend special treatment to a family that showed me none when I needed it most." "I understand completely," Julian said. "And for what it is worth, I am sorry. Not just for staying silent all those years ago, but for every year since, when I told myself it was too late to make things right." Elena studied him for a long moment, recognizing genuine remorse rather than the performative apologies Damien had offered the previous night. "Apology accepted," she said finally, "though I imagine the coming days will test how far that sincerity extends." Julian nodded slowly. "There is something else you should know," he said. "Priya came to see me this morning before you arrived. She asked me directly whether the rumors about our family's financial situation were true. I did not lie to her. I could not after everything that has already come to light. She left without saying much, but I do not think she plans to go through with the wedding until she understands the full truth." Elena felt a small, quiet satisfaction at this news, though it was not the vindictive kind. She thought of Priya's sharp intelligence during their conversation in the hallway, the way she had seen through the family's carefully maintained image far quicker than anyone expected. "She deserves the truth," Elena said. "Whatever she decides afterward is entirely her own choice to make." Before Elena could leave the cafe, her phone rang, and she saw Constance's name flash across the screen. She hesitated for a moment before answering, curious what approach the older woman would take now that the truth had begun surfacing. "Elena," Constance said, her voice tight and controlled, though the usual condescension had been replaced by something closer to desperation. "I think we need to speak, woman to woman, without the theatrics of last night." "I am listening," Elena said. "I know you must feel a great deal of satisfaction right now," Constance continued, "watching us struggle, watching Damien panic. I imagine after everything, you believe we deserve this." "I have not said anything about what you deserve," Elena replied evenly. "I have simply managed a business matter according to its original terms." Constance's voice sharpened slightly. "Do not pretend this is purely business. You know exactly what calling in those loans would mean for this family. You could offer an extension. You have that authority, do you not?" "I do," Elena confirmed. "And I have not yet decided whether I will exercise it." There was a brief pause on the line, something like hope flickering into Constance's tone. Then there is still a chance to resolve this reasonably. There is a chance, Elena agreed. But it will not be resolved through a phone call filled with the same condescension you showed me the day you told lawyers I was unsuitable for this family. If you want a genuine conversation, Constance, it will require honesty, not manipulation. Constance was quiet for a long moment. What do you want from me, Elena? An apology? I can give you that if it helps. I do not need your apology to make a sound business decision, Elena said, but I will tell you this. I built everything I have without a single ounce of help from this family. I do not owe you leniency simply because the consequences of your own choices have finally caught up to you. The call ended shortly after, Constance's voice trailing off into something unreadable, somewhere between anger and quiet defeat. Elena set her phone down, exhaled slowly, and allowed herself a brief moment to simply sit with the weight of the conversation, before continuing with her day. Later that same day, Elena received a message from Damien, requesting an urgent meeting at a private office space he sometimes used for business dealings separate from the family estate. She debated ignoring the request entirely, but ultimately decided that hearing him out directly might reveal something useful about how the family intended to respond to the unfolding situation. She arrived to find Damien pacing near the window, his usual polished composure completely absent, replaced by visible desperation. "Thank you for coming," he said, though his tone carried more urgency than gratitude. "You wanted to speak with me," Elena said, taking a seat across from his desk without waiting for an invitation. Damien ran a hand through his hair, clearly struggling to organize his thoughts. "I spoke with my father this morning. He told me everything. About the loans, about your position within Vesper Capital, about all of it." He paused, studying her face as though searching for some remaining trace of the woman who once loved him unconditionally. "Elena, whatever happened between us, I am asking you, please, do not do this. My family's entire future depends on those loans remaining in place. If you call them in, we lose everything. The estate, my business, all of it. You should have considered that before you and your mother decided I deserved nothing when I needed support the most," Elena said, her voice calm but unwavering. "I know I made mistakes," Damien said, his voice cracking slightly with genuine desperation now bleeding through his earlier arrogance. "I know I should have stood up for you back then. I was young, and my mother had convinced me that our marriage was a mistake, that you would hold me back from the life I was supposed to have. I regret it, Elena. I have regretted it for years, even if I never had the courage to say it out loud." Elena studied him carefully, recognizing that whatever regret he felt now was tangled up with self-preservation rather than genuine remorse for the pain he had caused her. "Regret is easy to feel once consequences finally arrive," she said. "It is much harder to feel it when you actually have the power to prevent harm and choose comfort instead." "So this is revenge then," Damien said, his voice hardening slightly. "You want to watch me lose everything because I hurt you 3 years ago?" "No," Elena said firmly. "If this were about revenge, I would have called in these loans the moment I discovered the connection to your family, without warning, without giving your father or Priya any opportunity to understand the truth first. I did not do that. I am simply refusing to protect people who have shown me nothing but cruelty, simply because protecting you would be more convenient for everyone involved." Damien fell silent, absorbing her words with an expression that shifted between anger and something closer to shame. "What do you want from me, Elena? An apology? Fine. I am sorry. I am sorry for everything. Is that enough to change your mind?" "An apology does not repay a debt, Damien," Elena said quietly. "It does not undo what happened, and it does not obligate me to extend financial leniency to a family that has spent years believing themselves untouchable. I am not interested in punishing you further than the natural consequences of your family's decisions already will. But I am also not interested in shielding you from those consequences simply because facing them frightens you now." Damien sat down slowly, defeated, the full weight of his situation finally settling over him. "Priya is going to leave me," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Once she understands everything, she will leave, and I will have nothing left. No wife, no fortune, nothing." "That outcome was set in motion long before I ever received that wedding invitation," Elena said, rising from her seat. "I am simply the reason the truth arrived sooner rather than later." She left his office without another word, descending to the street below, where the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pavement. She thought about the conversation, replaying Damien's desperation, his half-hearted apology, and the way he still seemed more concerned with the consequences to himself than with any genuine understanding of the pain he had caused her years earlier. It confirmed something she had already suspected. People rarely changed simply because circumstances forced them to face a mirror. Real change required a willingness to examine oneself honestly, something Damien had never once demonstrated, not during their marriage, and not now. On her way back to the office, Elena received a short message from Priya, asking if they could speak privately before the wedding proceeded any further. Elena agreed, and they met later that afternoon at a quiet park bench a few blocks from the hotel where the wedding festivities were being organized. Priya looked visibly shaken, though she carried herself with a composed dignity that Elena respected. "I spoke with Julian this morning," Priya said, sitting down beside her. "He confirmed everything. The loans, the estate, the business troubles. Damien has been lying to me for months, telling me the wedding delays were simply due to family scheduling conflicts, when really, they could not afford half of what they promised." "I am sorry you had to find out this way," Elena said, and she meant it. "Are you?" Priya asked, studying her carefully. "Or are you satisfied that the truth came out before I made a mistake I could not undo?" Elena considered the question honestly. "Both things can be true," she said. "I am glad you know the truth before committing to a marriage built on lies, but I take no pleasure in watching you go through this pain. I understand exactly how it feels to discover the person you trusted was never who you believed them to be." Priya nodded slowly, some of the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. "I am not going through with the wedding," she said quietly. "I already told Damien this morning. He begged me to reconsider, promised things would be different, that he would find a way to fix everything. But I cannot build a life with someone who was willing to let me walk into a marriage blind to the truth of his family's situation." "That is a wise decision," Elena said. "I keep wondering what my life would have looked like if I never learned any of this," Priya admitted. "If Andrew had not recognized your name that night, I might have married him anyway, built a life on assumptions that were never true." "You would have found out eventually," Elena said. "Truth has a way of surfacing no matter how carefully it is buried." Priya studied her for a long moment. "Thank you," she said finally, "for not letting me walk into this blind, even though you had every reason to let me suffer the consequences of a family that hurt you deeply." "You did nothing to deserve that kind of consequence," Elena said simply. "Only Damien and Constance earned what is coming to them." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, two women who had both been underestimated by the same family, finding an unexpected understanding between them despite the circumstances that had brought them together. That evening, Elena met with Marcus to finalize the formal notice regarding the outstanding loan terms. They reviewed every detail together, ensuring complete accuracy before the documents were prepared for delivery. "Are you certain about the timing?" Marcus asked, watching her carefully as she reviewed the final paperwork. "The wedding is tomorrow," Elena said. "The terms were due for renegotiation days ago, and the family has made no serious attempt to address the shortfall. I am not creating this consequence, Marcus. I am simply allowing it to arrive on schedule." Marcus nodded, though concern remained visible in his expression. "And Priya? Julian mentioned she might not go through with the wedding at all." "That decision belongs entirely to her," Elena said. "I only want to make sure she has the truth in front of her before she decides." As night fell over the city, Elena stood once more at her office window, looking out over the skyline she had come to know so intimately over the past 3 years. Tomorrow would bring an end to a chapter of her life that had haunted her for far too long, not through cruelty or vengeance, but through the simple, unstoppable arrival of truth long overdue. She felt calm, steady, and for the first time since receiving that gold-edged invitation, entirely at peace with whatever the coming day would bring. The wedding day arrived under a clear sky, the Voss estate decorated with white flowers and rows of elegant chairs arranged across the back lawn, exactly as Constance had planned months in advance. Guests began arriving early, dressed in their finest, unaware that the marriage they had gathered to witness had already quietly collapsed the day before. Elena arrived just before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, dressed simply, her expression calm and composed, despite the storm she knew was about to unfold. She was not there as a guest anymore, not truly. She was there as the final piece of a truth that had been building for days, ready to reveal itself completely in front of everyone the Voss family had spent years trying to impress. She found Marcus waiting near the entrance, a folder tucked under his arm containing the formal notice regarding the outstanding loans. "Are you certain about this?" he asked quietly, though his tone suggested he already knew her answer. "The family was given every opportunity to address the situation honestly," Elena said. "Constance chose to spend the last 2 days trying to manipulate her way out of consequences rather than facing them directly. I gave them time. That time has run out." Naomi had offered to accompany her that morning, worried about what Elena might face walking back into that estate one final time, but Elena had gently declined. "I need to do this on my own," she had told her assistant over the phone. "Not because I am afraid, but because this is the last thing I owe to the woman I used to be. She deserves to see this ending clearly, without anyone standing between her and the truth she fought so hard to reach." Naomi had understood, though she made Elena promise to call the moment everything was finished. Elena had agreed, tucking her phone into her bag before stepping out of the car and walking toward the estate gates, steady and resolved. Inside the main house, chaos had already begun brewing long before Elena arrived. Damien paced anxiously near a side room, still dressed in his wedding attire despite Priya's absence, clinging to a desperate hope that perhaps she would change her mind and appear after all. Constance moved through the halls issuing sharp instructions to the staff, attempting to maintain the appearance of normalcy even as murmurs spread among early arriving guests about the bride's conspicuous absence. "Where is she?" Damien demanded when his mother finally found a moment to speak with him privately. "The ceremony starts in less than an hour." "She is not coming, Damien," Constance said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "You know this. She told you herself yesterday." "She might still change her mind," Damien insisted, though even he seemed to recognize the desperation in his own words. Constance studied her son for a long moment, something like genuine sorrow flickering behind her usually composed expression. "This is not simply about Priya anymore," she said quietly. "Andrew has been speaking with other guests. Word is spreading about the loans, about Vesper Capital. If Elena decides to act on this today, in front of everyone, we lose far more than just this wedding." Before Damien could respond, a commotion near the front entrance drew their attention. Elena had arrived, accompanied by Marcus, and her presence rippled through the gathering guests like a stone dropped into still water. Whispers spread rapidly. Guests who had heard fragments of the previous night's rumors now watching closely, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Julian intercepted Elena near the entrance, his expression heavy with resignation rather than surprise. "I assume you are here to finish what began at the rehearsal dinner," he said quietly. "I am here because your family was given every chance to resolve this honestly," Elena said. Constance chose otherwise. Julian nodded slowly, accepting this without argument. "Do what you came to do," he said. "I will not stand in your way. This family has avoided the truth for far too long already." Elena moved through the gathering crowd with calm, deliberate steps, Marcus close behind her. Constance intercepted her near the center of the lawn, her expression a carefully controlled mask of composure that could not fully hide the panic simmering beneath it. "You would not dare do this here," Constance said quietly, her voice trembling slightly despite her attempt at authority. "In front of everyone. You invited everyone here to witness your family's triumph," Elena said. "I think it is only fair they witness the truth as well." Damien appeared beside his mother, his face pale, his earlier confidence completely stripped away. "Elena, please," he said, his voice cracking with genuine desperation now. "Whatever you are about to do, think about what it means, not just for me, but for everyone here, my father, our staff, people who depend on this family for their livelihoods." Elena studied him for a long moment, recognizing the manipulation woven into his plea, an attempt to shift responsibility for the consequences onto her shoulders rather than acknowledging the choices that had led them here. "I have thought about it carefully, Damien," she said. "And I have decided that protecting people from consequences they created themselves has never once led to genuine change. It only delays the inevitable." She turned to Marcus, who stepped forward and addressed the gathering crowd, his voice clear and steady despite the tension thick in the air. "For those who are unaware," he began, "Vesper Capital, the investment firm I represent alongside Elena Cross, holds the primary loans secured against this estate and against Voss Investments, the business venture currently operating under Damien Voss's name. As of this morning, those loans have entered default due to failure to meet renegotiated terms discussed extensively with the family over the past several weeks." A wave of stunned murmurs spread through the crowd, guests turning toward one another in shock and disbelief. Constance's composed mask finally shattered completely, her hands trembling as she reached for Damien's arm, though whether for support or control, it was impossible to tell. "This is a mistake," Constance said loudly, attempting to regain control of the narrative. "A misunderstanding that can easily be resolved." "There is no misunderstanding," Elena said, her voice calm but carrying clearly across the lawn. "The terms were clear from the beginning. Multiple extensions were already granted before today. I am simply enforcing an agreement your family signed willingly." Andrew, standing near the front of the gathered guests, spoke up quietly but firmly. She is telling the truth. I confirmed it myself. Vesper Capital's position is entirely legitimate. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, confusion shifting rapidly into judgment as guests began piecing together the full scope of what was unfolding in front of them. Years of carefully cultivated social standing began crumbling within minutes, exposed entirely by the simple, unavoidable arrival of financial truth. Several business partners who had traveled specifically to celebrate the union between the Voss and Malhotra families exchanged uneasy glances before quietly making their way toward the exit, unwilling to be associated with a scandal that would likely dominate local business circles for months to come. One man, a longtime associate of Julian's who had known the family for decades, paused briefly beside Julian on his way out. "I am sorry it came to this," the man said quietly. "You deserved better from your own family's choices." Julian simply nodded, too weary to offer any further response. Constance watched the guests depart one by one, her carefully built world unraveling with each departing car, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she found herself utterly without a strategy to salvage the situation. She had spent years believing that appearances alone could sustain a family standing indefinitely, that as long as the surface remained polished, the cracks beneath could stay hidden forever. Watching that belief collapse in real time in front of the very people she had spent decades trying to impress left her strangely hollow, as though something essential inside her had finally run out of room to hide. A member of the household staff approached Constance hesitantly, asking quietly whether they should begin removing the ceremonial arrangements from the lawn. Constance stared blankly at the neat rows of white chairs, the delicate flower arrangements now standing as a strange, ironic monument to a celebration that would never take place. She nodded silently, unable to summon the composure to respond with words. Damien turned toward Elena, something breaking completely behind his eyes. "You planned this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You planned this from the moment you received that invitation." "No," Elena said quietly, stepping closer so only he could hear her clearly. "You planned this the moment you decided cruelty was an acceptable way to treat someone who once loved you completely. I simply chose not to protect you from what you built." She turned and walked away from him, leaving Damien standing alone amid the wreckage of a life he had spent years constructing on borrowed foundations and inherited arrogance. Guests began quietly departing the estate, whispered conversations trailing behind them, the story of the collapsed Voss wedding certain to spread rapidly through social circles long before the sun set that evening. Julian found Elena near the front gates as she prepared to leave. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for giving Priya the chance to walk away before it was too late. And for giving me the chance to finally speak honestly, even if it took losing everything to get there." "What will you do now?" Elena asked. "Rebuild, I suppose," Julian said, glancing back toward the estate, where staff had already begun quietly dismantling the wedding decorations. "Honestly, though I feel like I should be devastated, there is a strange relief in finally having the truth out in the open. We have been living under the weight of pretending for far too long." Elena nodded, understanding the sentiment more deeply than she could fully express. "Sometimes losing everything is the only way to start building something real," she said. As she walked toward her car, she passed Constance standing alone near the fountain, her earlier composure completely gone, replaced by something hollow and defeated. Their eyes met briefly, and for a moment, Elena considered saying something, some final word to close the chapter that had defined so much of her pain. But she found she did not need to say anything at all. The silence between them said everything necessary. Elena walked toward her car, thinking about the girl she had been 3 years ago, broken and discarded, and about the woman she had become, steady and unshaken, capable of facing an entire family's collapse without losing herself in the process. She got into her car and started the engine, pausing for one final moment to look back at the estate, the place that had once represented everything she believed she needed to belong to, and now stood as nothing more than the sight of a truth finally allowed to surface. Then she pulled away, the golden afternoon light stretching long shadows across the lawn behind her. Her phone buzzed as she drove, a message from Priya. "I heard what happened today. Thank you again, for everything. I hope you find whatever peace you have been looking for." Elena smiled faintly at the message, setting her phone aside as she continued down the long road leading away from the estate. Another message followed shortly after, this one from Marcus. "It is done. Papers filed, everything documented properly. How are you feeling?" Elena considered the question carefully before responding. "Lighter," she typed back simply, and she realized as she pressed send that it was entirely true. She thought about calling Naomi as promised, but decided the conversation could wait until she reached home, where she could sit quietly and fully absorb everything that had happened without the distraction of traffic and city noise. Instead, she rolled down her window slightly, letting the late afternoon air fill the car, carrying with it the faint scent of cut grass and distant rain that always seemed to follow a long, difficult day. 3 years ago, she had believed her life ended the day Damien left the divorce papers on the kitchen counter. She had believed in her lowest moments that nothing good could ever grow from that kind of devastation. Yet here she was, driving away from the very family that had once convinced her she was worthless, carrying with her not bitterness, but a quiet, unshakable sense of closure. She thought about Margaret Doyle's hardware store, still standing because of the work she had done years earlier. She thought about Marcus, who had believed in her when belief cost him nothing but time and patience. She thought about the tiny office above the laundromat, with its crooked hand-painted sign, and how far that small, stubborn beginning had carried her. The road stretched ahead of her, open and quiet, leading back toward the city where her company waited, where new challenges and new opportunities would continue arriving, regardless of what had happened today. She did not know exactly what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in 3 years, she felt entirely free to meet it, without the shadow of her past pulling at her every step. Whatever came next for Damien, for Constance, for the family that had once tried to erase her completely, it no longer belonged to her story. She had closed that chapter fully and completely, and ahead of her stretched a future she had built entirely on her own terms, free from the weight of a past that no longer had any power to define her. 2 weeks after the wedding that never happened, Elena sat in her office reviewing quarterly reports when Naomi knocked lightly on the open door, holding a newspaper folded to a particular page. "You should see this," Naomi said, setting it down on the desk. The article covered the sudden collapse of Voss Investments, detailing how the firm had defaulted on multiple loans and was now undergoing liquidation to satisfy outstanding debts. A smaller paragraph near the bottom mentioned that the family estate had been listed for sale, with proceeds expected to cover the remaining balance owed to creditors. Elena read through it once, then set it aside without much reaction. "Do you feel anything, reading that?" Naomi asked carefully. Elena considered the question honestly. "Less than I expected," she admitted. "I thought there would be more satisfaction in it. Instead, it just feels like the closing of an old account, nothing more." "That might be healthier than satisfaction," Naomi said. Elena managed a small smile. "Maybe." That same week, an unexpected email arrived from Andrew Whitfield, the business associate who had first recognized her at the rehearsal dinner. He wrote briefly, congratulating her on handling the situation with clarity and professionalism, and mentioning that several other companies in the city had reached out to Vesper Capital afterward, impressed by how the firm managed a delicate situation without unnecessary scandal. Elena forwarded the message to Marcus with a short note. "Word travels quickly in this business." His reply came almost instantly. "Good work travels faster than bad reputations, Elena. You have nothing to worry about." She read his message twice, allowing herself a rare moment of quiet pride before returning to the stack of reports waiting on her desk. Over the following weeks, Elena's life settled back into its familiar rhythm. Her company continued expanding, taking on new clients, restructuring struggling businesses much the same way she had years earlier, when she was still building everything from a tiny office above a laundromat. She found herself thinking less and less about Damien, about Constance, about the wedding that had unraveled so completely in front of everyone who had once admired the Voss family's polished image. One afternoon, she received an unexpected visit from Priya, who arrived at her office holding 2 cups of coffee and a hesitant smile. "I hope this is not intruding," Priya said. "I wanted to see how you were doing, and I realized I never properly thanked you for what you did that day." Elena gestured for her to sit, accepting the coffee gratefully. "How have you been?" she asked. Priya settled into the chair across from her desk. "Better than I expected, honestly. It hurt, obviously, discovering everything the way I did. But I have been focusing on my own work again, the design firm I put on hold while planning the wedding. It feels good to have that back." "I am glad to hear it," Elena said, and she meant it sincerely. "I heard Damien moved out of the city," Priya said carefully, watching Elena's reaction. "Apparently he took a position with a smaller firm somewhere upstate, starting over, from what I understand." Elena absorbed this information calmly. "That is probably the healthiest thing that could happen to him," she said. "Sometimes people need to lose everything they built on false foundations before they can begin building something real." "Do you think he learned anything from it?" Priya asked. "I do not know," Elena admitted. Some people learn from losing everything. Others simply grow bitter and blame the world for what their own choices caused. I hope, for his sake, he chooses the first path. But I no longer feel responsible for which one he takes. And Constance? Priya asked. Selling the estate, Elena said. Downsizing considerably. Julian mentioned they are looking at a much smaller property outside the city. Priya studied her for a moment. Does it feel strange, knowing you played such a large part in all of that? Elena thought carefully before answering. I did not create their downfall, Priya. I simply stopped shielding them from consequences that had been building long before I ever received that invitation. What they do with what remains is entirely up to them now. Priya nodded, seeming to understand completely. For what it is worth, she said, I am glad I met you, even under those circumstances. You showed me something important, about strength, about not letting other people's cruelty define who you become afterward. They spoke a while longer, easy conversation flowing between two women who had once been positioned as rivals by circumstance, but who now found a genuine, unexpected friendship forming instead. Before leaving, Priya extended an invitation for Elena to visit her new design studio sometime, an offer Elena accepted with genuine warmth. A few days later, Julian reached out again, asking to meet at the same small cafe where they had spoken before the wedding. He looked considerably lighter than he had during their previous conversations. Some of the exhaustion finally lifted from his expression. I wanted to update you, he said, once they had settled at their usual table. We finalized the sale of the estate last week. It was difficult, letting go of a place that had been in the family for 2 generations, but honestly, Elena, it feels like the first honest decision this family has made in years. How is Constance handling it? Elena asked. Struggling, Julian admitted. She built her entire identity around that house, around the image it represented. Losing it has forced her to confront things about herself she spent decades avoiding. I do not know if she will ever fully change, but at least now she cannot hide behind appearances the way she used to. And you? Elena asked. How are you handling everything? Julian considered the question thoughtfully. Strangely at peace, he said. I spent so many years quietly ashamed of decisions I never had the courage to challenge. Watching everything collapse in a strange way gave me permission to finally start over honestly. I have taken a much smaller position at a firm downtown, nothing glamorous, but it is work I actually find meaningful. That sounds like a good beginning, Elena said. I wanted to ask you something, Julian said, his tone shifting slightly, more careful. Do you regret any part of what happened? Calling in the loans, letting the truth surface the way it did? Elena thought about the question seriously before answering. No, she said finally. I regret many things about my past, Julian. I regret trusting people who never deserved that trust. I regret staying silent for far too long when I should have spoken up for myself. But I do not regret allowing the truth to surface. Truth, even painful truth, tends to lead people towards something more honest eventually. I believe that applies to your family as much as it applied to me. Julian nodded slowly, gratitude evident in his expression. Thank you, Elena, for everything. I know I do not deserve your kindness after everything my family put you through, but I am grateful for it nonetheless. You were kind to me when it mattered most, Elena said. That counts for something. Before they parted ways that afternoon, Julian mentioned one final detail. Priya stopped by the old estate last week, before the final sale closed. She wanted to collect a few belongings she had left behind during the engagement. She asked about you, whether you were doing well. I told her you seemed genuinely happy, building something meaningful out of everything that happened. That was kind of you to say, Elena said. It was simply the truth, Julian replied. Sometimes that is the only thing worth saying at all. Months passed, and Elena's life continued expanding in directions she had never fully imagined possible. Her company grew steadily, taking on larger projects, mentoring young entrepreneurs the way Marcus had once mentored her when she had nothing but determination and a talent for spotting patterns others overlooked. She began speaking occasionally at small business conferences, sharing her story carefully, without naming names, focusing instead on the lessons she had learned about resilience, about rebuilding from nothing, about refusing to let other people's cruelty define the trajectory of an entire life. During one such conference, a young woman approached her afterward, nervous and hesitant, explaining that she had recently left an unhealthy relationship and was struggling to imagine any kind of future beyond simple survival. Elena spoke with her for nearly 20 minutes, offering practical advice about rebuilding finances and confidence, but more importantly, offering the simple reassurance that pain, however overwhelming it felt in the moment, did not have to define the rest of her story. The young woman left with tears in her eyes, though for the first time in months, They were tears of hope rather than despair. Elena thought about that conversation often in the weeks that followed, recognizing in the young woman's uncertain eyes a reflection of who she herself had once been. One evening, nearly 6 months after the collapsed wedding, Elena stood on the balcony of her new apartment, looking out over a city skyline that had become deeply familiar to her over the years. Marcus joined her, holding 2 glasses of sparkling cider, celebrating the recent closing of their largest deal yet, a partnership that would expand their firm's reach into international markets. "You seem different lately," Marcus observed, handing her a glass. "Lighter, somehow." Elena smiled, considering his words carefully. "I think I finally let go of something I did not even realize I was still carrying," she said. "For years, some part of me measured my success against what Damien and his family thought of me. Even after everything I built, some quiet part of me still wanted them to see it, to understand what they lost." "And now?" Marcus asked. "Now I build for myself," Elena said simply, "not to prove anything to anyone who hurt me. Just because it is genuinely who I am." Marcus raised his glass slightly. "To building things that actually last," he said. Elena clinked her glass against his, looking out over the city lights stretching endlessly toward the horizon. She thought about the tiny office above the laundromat, the crooked hand-painted sign, the countless nights of uncertainty that had eventually led her here. She thought about Priya, rebuilding her own life with quiet determination. She thought about Julian, finally finding honesty after decades of silence. And she thought, briefly, about Damien and Constance, somewhere far from the world they once believed they controlled completely, learning slowly, painfully, what it meant to build something real rather than something merely polished. Elena did not know exactly what the future held, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt entirely certain of one thing. Whatever came next, she would meet it as herself, fully, without apology, and without ever again allowing anyone to convince her that she was anything less than exactly enough. The city lights flickered steadily below her, endless and alive, much like the future she had chosen to build entirely on her own terms.